We made this.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shipwrecked and Comatose, the Red Dwarf podcast on the We Made This podcast network. My name is Kurt North, and welcome to our Season 3 coverage. We're at Season 3 already, still a long way to go, but we are here at Season 3, and the episode we're going to be reviewing or looking at today is Backwards, and that is Episode 1, Series 3. It aired on the 14th of November, 1989. We're not even in 1990 yet. And joining me is, as always, for these main episodes, well, so far anyway, is Mark Adams. Mark, Season 3's here. What do you think?
I think we've done pretty well, considering halfway through the year this podcast didn't exist.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride, and especially something that's actually becoming fast dear to my heart. So, you know, having a good group of people. Backstage, we recorded the Christmas special, which will have aired by now. So that was good with all five of us. So it's all good. And of course, we always have
pandemonium, Kurt. But it was fun pandemonium. But it was don't say it was good. I'm just glad I didn't edit that one. I'm glad you edited that, because fucking hell, 5 people on a podcast once a year.
It's definitely not the future. It's definitely a one-off or one per year, as you say, yeah. But also, obviously, as always, we have one of our regular guests on the show, and this week we have Matt Latham. Matt, how are things going over down yonder?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Yeah, I'm ready to talk about Red Dwarf.
Yeah, absolutely. Just another side project from Pick a Disc, and how's Pick a Dick? Pick a Dick.
Pick a Dick. Now I'd listen to that, mate. That sounds well good. I'd at least listen to more than just the odd episode of that compared to Pick a Disc.
you say that you're not the first person to make that Freudian slip.
Right, well, to be fair, it's good to know.
To be fair, I mean, that's happened more than once, and I am on the verge of changing the name to something slightly more easier and less prone to it. So I am kind of thinking of going with solicited disc picks, but
I don't know about that
as a name. But
I can see the Freudian slip already. Absolutely,
what Freudian slip? That's Freud proof.
I don't think it is. Anyway, we're here to talk about Red Dwarf. We're here to talk about Season 3. Just before we begin for Backwards, Season 3, I know, Matt, we talked about in the specials with the 3 million years stuff, that obviously there was this big change in style and stuff. But Mark, this is your first opportunity to actually talk about this. So Season 3 has a stylistic change. They brought in a lot of people from Doctor Who, which I know is dear to your heart. But what do you make to the change in style and the new obviously they've got a bit more money and stuff like that, and obviously the introduction of Starbug 1. What do you make to it?
So the very first note I made for Season 3, Episode 1 was "Yay for the proper theme," and for me, because I went back to watching Series 1 and 2 after I'd been watching, I think 4, 5, 6, and maybe 3, and then 1 and 2. This feels more like the Red Dwarf that I knew, or at least the first Red Dwarf I encountered. And yeah, it does feel almost like they've doubled the production values overnight.
They did, yeah. I mean, I was watching the quarantine YouTube videos for these 2 episodes for the next 2 weeks, just today, and they actually talk about, did they get any more money? And Ed Byard said that they did get more money, but it was really more on that they were doing more location shoots rather than actually having more special, money for the special effects as such. So it's obviously the people that bought on, like Peter Wagon and the like, that obviously had this style and this change, costumes and all that kind of thing as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we get into it. I mean, do you like, obviously the style feels more sci-fi and stuff like that as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it just had a little bit more pizzazz. I feel like the first 2 series were quite understated and benefited from that. But this, they clearly wanted Crichton back permanently, and They invested in that, and they changed the theme. It just felt like it was like it had. I really hate this term. But it felt like it was on steroids.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I hate that term. It's so fucking lazy. But you know what I mean? It feels like it had a shot in the arm, and they created the Red Dwarf that, in my head, the 3 to 6 were the strongest seasons.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I think we'd all agree with that. You look at this episode and the two that follow it as well. I mean, season 3, I think a lot of people would say is one of their favourite seasons, but you've got backwards, you've got Marooned and Polymorph. I mean, those aren't bad titles to have as your 3 episodes of the first season for the third season, is it?
No. I mean, it starts well. I mean, again, I pretty much I've rewatched all of series 3 recently, and I watched Backwards and Marooned. About pretty much about 20. I finished about 20 minutes before we started recording, and particularly with the 2 I'm guesting on, really quite strong episodes. I mean, Backwards, I think, doesn't hold up as much as I remember it holding up. If I'm completely honest, but I think that might be because of the podcast and I rewatch series 2. Is that for me rewatching series 2? I feel like that's actually one of low-key the perhaps unsung classic series with almost practically perfect.
I think you're right. I think that the series 1 and 2, having rewatched them as a 42-year-old man rather than a 15-year-old boy, they are grossly underrated.
Particularly with the second series as well. I think as we get into number 3, the sci-fi in the sci-fi comedy kind of kicked in, and it was able to go into their kind of new direction, and I don't really. I'm trying to stop myself from kind of talk about Marooned, but they're like a lot of the kind of setup that they did and like kind of episode structure of the previous series, kind of gets lost. So you don't have a lot of the bunk scenes that like last half an episode. And builds up and pays off later on. But on the flip side, you get something that looks like it actually is in the future. It looks, you can actually say it's science fiction, and it looks science fiction.
Yeah.
And to be fair, the first 3 kind of are like a nice new soft reboot, like one of the first of many soft reboots the show does. To kind of say, yeah, this is what we think we'll probably do now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just talking on season 3 as a whole. Just looking at the episodes, as I mentioned, you've got Backwards, Maroon, which has got the elements which we'll talk about next week. Polymorph, which is again the sci-fi thing, but then you get to like Body Swap and Time Slides, and Time Slides to me could quite easily, in some ways, fit in season 1 or 2. And then The Last Day. So you've got there is elements of it, but as you say, the soft reboot was a word that came into my head as well. Especially stylistically, it obviously is. I'd agree with that too. It does feel like almost like a reboot, but I'm glad it wasn't a reboot. Yeah. I mean, it's just as I say, the stylistic approach with it. It does feel like there's more money, but if they're saying there wasn't that much, it was more for location. What they've done is they've done it really well. And it is interesting how we talk about this episode, and this is obviously on location. Let's talk about that in a bit more detail now. It starts off with the Series 3 scroll, which is Red Dwarf 3, the saga continues. The story so far, 3 million years in the future, Dave Lister, the last human being alive, discovers he is pregnant after liaison with his female self in a parallel universe. His pregnancy concludes with the successful delivery of twin boys, Jim and Bexley. However, because they were conceived in another universe with different physical laws, they suffer from highly accelerated growth rates and are both 18 years old within 3 days of being born. In order to save their lives, Lister returns them to the universe of their origin, where they are reunited with their father, in brackets, a woman, and are able to lead comparatively normal lives. Well, as normal as you can be if you've been born in a parallel universe and your father's a woman and your mother's a man, and you're 18 years old 3 days after your birth. Shortly after, Crichton, the service mechanoid who has left the ship after being rescued from his old crashed vessel, the Nova 5, is found in pieces after his space bike crash lands onto an asteroid. Lister rebuilds the Noid, but he fails to recapture his former personality. Meanwhile, Holly, the increasingly erratic Red Dwarf computer, performs a head sex change operation on himself. He bases his new face on Hilly, a female computer with whom he'd once fallen madly in love with. And now the saga continues. So, thoughts, chaps?
It's a cop-out, but I'm glad they did it instead of Doodad.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, same. I mean, I don't think I've... Is it Dad? Dad was the script, wasn't it? Did they release it online, or was it actually animated, or am I getting confused with...
Yeah, it's a script that they had Chris Barry read out, who basically did all the voices, and it's an 8-minute thing that you can watch on YouTube, and we covered that just before the Christmas special with Colin.
Yes, of course, that I listened to when it was released.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes, of course. Now, actually, saying that, I keep getting confused with, I think it's the Identity. Is it the Identity Within, which is the cat-focused one that was a DVD extra? Because I definitely remember that one. But
we're going to get to them all eventually.
Yeah, but no, yeah. Again, I think it is a bit of a cop out. But then again, I think perhaps with the as you mentioned, the soft reboot, starting the third series with resolving a cliffhanger, and everything looks like it's been upscaled with gigapixel AI into 4K from like 360 YouTube video from like 2009 of the first two seasons. He'd probably give it a very cluttered or inconsistent look, and probably wouldn't flow well. So I can kind of see perhaps from a production side that trying to continue what they did, trying to tell that story with the different sets they've got. I can kind of see why they didn't, because I think that would probably be very confusing for new viewers who are probably going to come into it straight away, because this could have been like the first episode for a lot of people. So I think particularly from what I remember here, like this is the era that people remember seeing first.
Yeah.
So if you saw part 2 of a 2-part story where like you suddenly had these babies grow into 18-year-old men, that probably wouldn't be as easy to follow as the weirdness of Backwards.
I think this is an interesting one because they clearly wanted to draw a line. They'd planned to carry on with Red Dwarf the way it was, and that's what Dad reflects. But they decided against that and wanted to draw a line. And you've got to remember at this time that even people with VHS players in 1999, which not everybody had, they had crap VHS players. It would have been almost impossible to read this scroll.
Yeah, because if you tried pausing it, it would be almost impossible, wouldn't it? Because you get
and it would have the wavy VHS thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know why they did that, because there was no DVD players to like do it frame by frame, and only the very, very most advanced VHS players would have frame by frame. So it's an odd choice rather than actually letting you read it.
I do quite like the idea that it was probably never meant to be read anyway, but they filled it out just in case. So just like the same idea that no, the technology is not going to be around for people to be able to take this episode and reverse it. So
yeah,
but I do quite like the kind of speed up Star Wars gag, because I think particularly again, if people are watching this for the first time thinking, sci-fi comedy, and then you have the pretty much iconic motif of the scrolling text from Star Wars.
True.
Basically, then like fast forwarding through. Even though saying that, when I watched it earlier on Netflix, it seems a lot slower than I remember it being. It's a lot. that text scroll is a lot slower. I honestly thought it was like a lot faster, but yeah. So if you have that kind of fast kind of spoof where it's like a load of text just going up that you can't read, that kind of like gives you an idea of what you're about to watch. Or so if you're thinking, oh, this is a science fiction show, and then suddenly you see like Story So Far, and with the saga continuums instead of the saga continues, being a kind of like play on that. I think it's like another mission statement saying, yeah, this isn't going to be another version of another science fiction show. This is going to be something that's meant to be funny.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely a piss take, and I don't know. I mean, obviously now, if this was done on any telly program, everyone would just stop it and play it, and it would lose its impact. And I do feel like this has a little more charm than when they did it for the USA pilots. But it was an odd choice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, but it's interesting though, because I mean, I know this is later in the episode, but we can talk about it now. Is that it wasn't as if they were self-aware of it, because you've got the scene in where the Reverse Brothers, where it's everyone knows this now when he's actually having a go at Crichton and Rimmer about the fight they've just had, that he's saying, there's that one nerd who's going to do this, that, and the other, and reverse this tape and find out a way of doing it, and blah blah blah. So they know that it's going to be capable to do that, and I actually like that as forward thinking, that they're not like saying, well, this isn't going to ever be read ever again, and they took the time of it, and I quite like that thought of it. But I think it would have been interesting, and I think, Mark, you're the same. I'm not sure, I can't remember what you said, Matt, but I definitely didn't see these in order. So the fact of not seeing 1 and 2 and then jumping into 3, I've always seen this as a jumble anyway. So it just would have been interesting at the time, had I watched it season on season, how much of a jarring change this would have been, and would I have accepted that scroll as just like, oh, what's happened here? What? How come Crichton's all of a sudden here? So it would have been interesting to think about it in that way.
Yeah, you're right. I'm in exactly the same boat. I definitely watched the later series before I got to watch 1 and 2. And I think it was Colin who said that they actually stalled on releasing 1 and 2 because of the production values. It wasn't actually possible to watch them on VHS in order if you were buying them when they came out, kind of thing.
Yeah, which is curious in itself, isn't it, really? But yeah, anyway, so moving on to the 2 opening scenes, both of which are up there in what probably my favourite moments of Red Dwarf. But we'll start with the first one, and that is the Wilma conversation. Matt, what do you think? What do you think to this bunk scene? Obviously, it's new bunks. It's there's a whole new thing. And Mark, don't worry, we will get to that hairnet, so don't worry about that. But Matt, so what do you think to this opening scene, for a season open, and also to just in itself, is it we're playing with the Cat and Lister kind of thing rather than Rimmer and Lister?
I think it's again soft reboots, and one of the things that I was reading about as well, is that there's a slight change. It's not massively changed, but there's a slight change to the character of the Cat, in that he's slightly more intelligent and he's slightly more friendly with Lister. And I think this kind of builds on the friendship that will probably be is probably going to be the same for most of the for the show and stuff, and does it in kind of like a funny way that I think highlights just how desperate and lonely these men are. Well, this man and Cat are, and oddly also again a very relevant and 80s reference in the Flintstones.
So, Mark, what do you think? Let's talk about Cat's dress sense first, and then it's interesting just what some of the Matts mentioned there about the isolation aspect. Something that's obviously been moved on from season 1 and 2. That you do have this almost like going crazy, a kind of hysteria going on within this. That they're actually talking about cartoons here, but what do you think? What do you think to the Cat's hairnet? We have seen it before, but not quite as good as this, I don't think.
I did enjoy the Cat's hairnet, And I like it when fastidious people are exposed. And that's something that, with a character like the cat, you shouldn't do very often, because when you do, it's very funny. So here, Dwayne Dibley, anything like that, they shouldn't do it every episode, and they do use it sparingly. But because such an intrinsic part of the character is how fastidious he is, it's fun to see when they're not, you know?
Yeah. And what do you think to the joke itself then? Just the way it's delivered, the lines that are obviously, you know, especially when it said, you know, towards the end where Liz is saying things like, this is crazy, why are we talking about going to bed with Wilma Flintstone? And then obviously the switch around at the end where you think he's just going to go, we're just nuts. And he says, obviously, we'll never leave Fred and you know it.
Well, for me, that joke was funny, but you've already, within the first few minutes, hit Mark's quotable Red Dwarf. I regularly use the line, I would go with replace Betty with whoever, but I'd be thinking of replace Wilma with whoever. So I don't know. I would go with Xander from Buffy, but I'd be thinking about Oz, whatever, something like that. And I do that all the time. I've done that from the very first time I heard this line, because I think it's fucking brilliant. It's so rude and so unacceptably offensive to everybody involved when you talk about it. I love it. And I want to flip this back. Go on, sorry.
I'm assuming you also have to put emphasis on the side Danny John Jules does. I'll be thinking of Wilma. But you have to kind of like...
But I'd be thinking of... Yeah, exactly right. But, so, can I ask you, as two heterosexual men, is Wilma much hotter than Betty? Because I thought Betty was quite attractive.
I'd be going for Betty, personally.
Would you?
Yeah.
What about you, Matt?
Probably Betty as well. I think... And I'm not a fan... To be fair, I'm not a fan of the high kind of like hairstyle of... Wilma, if I'm completely honest, but and to fair, and it's like a side note as well. There's that's like my favorite kind of like Flintstones gag, but just not as good. But and whenever I listen to it, I always remember it. Always reminds me of this other gag from Family Guy, where where Peter and Lois I can't remember the exact reason why, but they're on the run. And the news report saying we're looking for a big fat man and a very attractive redhead, and they just show a picture of of Fred and Wilma Flintstone. So whenever the Flintstones are brought up, it's this scene and that scene from Family Guy that are always brought up, and it's kind of like the kind of both kind of, whereas like kind of both trying to attack me at the same time.
I've got a real soft spot for the Flintstones. I loved it as a kid. And I think at some point I will be covering it on my podcast about kids' telly, right in the childhood, here on the We Made This podcast network. But I don't feel like people who are attracted to men got a very good deal when it came to the Flintstones. Betty, hot. Wilma, hot, but slightly dodgy hairdo. Fred and Barney, they're just not so sexy, are they?
I think it's that weird trope of US sitcoms. When you think about it as well, you've got what?
Homer and Marge.
Yeah, Marge, Peter Griffin, and Lois. I'm trying to think of live action ones as well, where you've got would Married with Children count? I think
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, good grief.
Because like Albin, was it the honeymoon? Was it the Honeymooners as well? Honeymooners, which is the famous one where it's pretty much where the punchline at the end was domestic violence. One of these days to the moon, where I think he was like Archie Bunker. I think the character was. Am I getting like?
That doesn't sound like a very nice television show. If the punchline is domestic violence,
then it's absolutely been like ripped to piss now.
Okay, good.
But I think the main character was basically the kind of the influence of Eric Cartman, to be fair. So if you kind of think of it like a Eric Cartman in his 40s as a postman, I think his wife was kind of like suddenly more attractive than perhaps she should have been but I'm pretty sure there's probably loads of other instances where it's kind of like the layabout slob and the attractive wife which is always been a kind of trope throughout US sitcoms. And if I know, I would have actually done a lot. I would have done a lot more research if I knew he was going to be talking about this, because there's loads of different things, and in terms of the reputation of the American family.
There's American shows that I'm thinking of that I can't honestly remember what they're called, but I can see them in my head, like and I can see characters, and I know what you mean. It definitely has that.
I mean, if you want to go, slight, not rude, but you could probably say later seasons of Friends with Chandler and Monica, but
you're such a bitch. That was savage.
Joey and Elle McPherson.
Yeah.
Or whatever she was called. Janine. Was it Janine? I can't remember her name now. But anyway, enough of our Friends rant. But that's an interesting subject, actually, thinking about, the way that Americans portray that aspect. But the next scene that we get, I mean, Mark, I'm not a person to go scene by scene, but this one for me, I think I said one of my favorite moments at the very beginning of all this was this particular scene. And it's the Starbug 1 driving test.
So, Kurt, I'm pretty sure that you've brought this scene up every time I've been on an episode.
Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, but I actually love this scene.
It's so good. It's just that driving tests are scary as fuck.
Yeah.
No one enjoyed their driving test, and it's done so well. And Crichton's such a fanny. And we were all a fanny when we took our driving test. It's just brilliant. And I love that they use a mechanoid rather than a human to kind of give everyone this scene that everyone's experienced that drives a car. It's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, this is obviously the first opportunity we get to do this. And Crichton, Robert Llewellyn, does this so well and throughout the whole show. Is when they say, and registration? And he just sort of turns around and goes, Starbug 1? It's his facial reaction to which I think is incredible. But yeah, I remember also just talking about driving tests. I mean, I remember I passed, I think it would have been on my third or fourth attempt, I think it was. And I remember going through some traffic lights on my second, and for the rest of the drive, it was on amber, but it was one of those touch and go moments. It was like, okay, and I went through it and I thought, oh shit. And for the rest of the test, it's obviously failed. And Crichton does this in this episode as well, which is, as I say, my favourite bit was the fact that they've kept in the fish line at the very beginning when Rimmer gets in there. And I was watching it. I actually watched this on the quarantine episode, and Ed Bye said that he didn't actually notice it until recently, and he was like, had I known, I would have nowadays you'd have taken seconds to get rid of it, because it appears once, then it's not there, then it's back again. And it's just one of my favorite moments of that little action figure just being fired out of Starbug 1. It's just, I just find it amazing. But the whole thing, as you mentioned there, the driving test thing is something I think is real good contemporary humor, because people can understand and have been through that kind of thing before.
And that's the thing about sci-fi, isn't it? Sci-fi isn't supposed to be really kind of hard and futuristic. It's supposed to have a futuristic setting, but reflect the current society it's written in a way that makes it easier to satirize or easier to attack or easier to just take the mickey out of in this case. And it's just so well done. I bloody love Red Dwarf.
In every kind of show that with a fantasy or science fiction thing that does something relatable in society, or just or stuff like as trying to take your driving test, it gives them a sense of relatability that you can kind of laugh at, but applying it for futuristic concepts and stuff. And yeah, so it's like the stuff that, can you read the registration, or when he's going through what does that sign mean? What does that sign mean? What does that sign mean? And it's just like, it's the Space Corps directives thing where you just go for the silliest thing you can think of, which makes no sense. But it's an easy laugh, but it's still quite...
like the danger. Space mirages ahead. It actually makes no sense, and it is just there for gag's sake, which I like. The What I particularly like it as well is that it's a new pairing as well, because you've got. I've already mentioned that the first scene is the cat and Lister, which we've seen before. We know their relationship if you've been and seen, the first two seasons. And I know Crichton obviously appeared last, in the beginning of season 2. But the Rimmer Crichton thing, I've joined them together, and Rimmer's true to form. He's exactly what you expect Rimmer to be as well. He's very kind of like, he has the empowerment of the driving license thing behind him, hasn't he? He's the driver instructor when actually he's just, and even himself, even then he can't get it right because he's still going. Well, what is it? It's a time hole. And Crichton's saying it, everyone's saying it. Rimmer's just going. A time hole is a phenomenon rarely seen in space, which legend would have believed transported to another part. Blah, blah, blah. And he goes, "That's a time hole." But I think it's true to Rimmer's character, and I like the fact that they're actually playing with that as well.
Yeah, it's a nice introduction of who the, in inverted commas, new Crichton is. He's timid and aims to please, a bit hapless, and some of the other characters are funny because of the jokes they crack. Sometimes the cat will crack a joke where he knows he's taking the mickey out of another character. Similarly with Lister, where he'll actually make a joke as a joke. Whereas Crichton never cracks a joke. He's funny by his mannerisms and his haplessness. And again, I feel like this is really good at establishing what this, again, in inverted commas, new Crichton is going to bring to the show.
I've only just, as you were just speaking, Mark, I've only just realised that, like he's saying, there's like a lot of the humour from Crichton is the physicality that Robert Llewellyn kind of does with the way that he walks and stuff. And then I just realised that pretty much it's a different kind of physicality that the other three do as well. I mean, Chris Barry's has got a very certain style of movement, kind of rigid, kind of attempting to be rigid, kind of like military-esque, that he balls up all the time. The cat is, kind of the smooth, kind of like he pretty much glides through, whereas Lister balances the slob and the heroic. And they somehow managed to find a fourth, completely different physical movement that fits in with the other three, and doesn't feel like it's aping anyone else as well. So like it's just, I mean, there are many different reasons I think that Crichton works in the ensemble, but just the way he looks, the way that he's moved, and because I think he's a lot smooth. I think David Ross, thinking about it, he's a lot smoother and less robotic. I mean, I think if you go back and watch Crichton Series 2, he doesn't have the same kind of like jangly, like kind of sudden movements that Robert Llewellyn does. Robert Llewellyn, you do kind of have the idea that it's an actual robot, and kind of judders and stuff, and kind of walks funny. Where if I remember David Ross rightly, he's a lot more human, or he's a lot smoother in his actions, and a bit less funny to look at, as Llewellyn does. And I think Llewellyn here pretty much manages to do that straight away in his first scene. Kind of has this physicality in him. They even do the editing trick to make him stutter by basically repeating the same, just looping the video over and over again, but making it look like he's juddering as a robot. And it's just like fits in it. It's like that missing piece in the ensemble, and it's a great first scene.
It is, yeah. I mean, actually, strangely enough as well, and I know we've, Matt, I think we briefly talked about this, was in Body Swap. There's actually the first scene he actually ever filmed was in Body Swap rather than this one. And there's been discussion on whether Marooned was actually, a lot of Marooned was filmed before this episode as well. So it's interesting that we're coming in direct straight into this. And he's had maybe a bit more time, because in Marooned he's definitely a lot different than what he is in this episode.
He's also got a completely different accent. He's completely Swedish in the last scenes of thing, and because I never noticed it until like an hour ago.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
But as I say, it's interesting. I think obviously production wise, this episode obviously takes place in Tatton Park of all places a lot of the time, up in Manchester.
I didn't know that. I
yeah.
go to Tatton Park. I had a socially distanced walk with my mum and dad in Tatton Park not so long ago.
Well, we'll have to meet up there because I've got family in Altrincham. So we'll have a social distance.
It was nice, but I couldn't give my mum a hug, which sucked.
True.
I haven't given my mum a hug in 9 months.
It does.
But it was still nice. I had a walk with my mum and my dad. We had a social distance picnic, and my mum couldn't go to the loo because they were closed.
Yeah, that's another story completely because I'm in the same boat with that. We get loads of people coming up to our work because of that, because a lot of like the Lake District is closed off and there's no toilets, and they all end up coming to me, which is great.
Lovely.
Yeah, so yes, at Tatton Park, it's a lot of backwards actually was filmed there. When we do get to this, there's a couple of things in these scenes actually when they crash land that the I don't know if you noticed, but the fish are absolutely humongous. Did you see the fish in the when the ships actually crash landed?
Were they koi carp?
I don't know.
I've never noticed that.
I mean, no. They are going backwards, but there's like it's like they filmed it almost in like a fishbowl at close quarters, and you look at it, and you know they're literally probably like 3 times the size of Crichton. But yeah, so that in itself is good. Do you think you would have caught the birds going backwards and some of the scenes that actually did the stock footage that they put in there just to give you the hint that that we're in a backwards universe? Or do you think that's something that you would, knowing yourself, would have just missed on first watch?
I don't know. Maybe the clue of the title as well. Maybe. But I am really dopey when it comes to that kind of shit. So maybe I wouldn't have spotted it. You know how like you get these people who can always spot the bloopers and the continuity errors in things. Like within seconds of it being broadcast, somebody had spotted that Starbucks cup on Game of Thrones. I still can't find that fucking Starbucks cup. I know the episode and I've watched it again to try and find that bloody Starbucks cup. Could I find it? Could I, Egg?
Did they not paste it out though? I thought they pasted that out.
Yeah, I think they've edited it. They edited it afterwards.
Ah, bollocks. No wonder I couldn't see the Starbucks cup.
I think it was only in the initial airing it aired with the Starbucks cup in it. But
no wonder I couldn't see it.
Yeah,
that explains it.
That was a bit of wasted time. Sorry.
Shit.
But we do get this is the first thing of Crichton having Holly on his chest as well. That we've get the scene with Holly, and this is obviously Hattie's first scene, pretty much, with regards to like sort of her using there's like an amalgamation of the two, isn't there? There's the bit of like trying to work out what day it is. What did you think to this idea that Holly was being ported around by Crichton?
I liked it. And I did feel like the first line that she had was very Holly and established that, you know, we have got a new actor playing the role, but she's going to be funny because it was funny. And I love Holly on Crichton's chest. I think it was a great idea. And whoever thought of that deserves a pint.
Of Erskib.
I kind of have issues with that, actually, think about it. But this is my kind of like IT as a profession kicking in that why on earth would you have an operating system that moves with you? I mean, because I'm making the assumption that Holly has ended up being lost with Rimmer and Crichton, but then obviously wouldn't there just be a copy on Red Dwarf or in Starbug? Whereas the impression you get later on.
Well, this is something that and I know that we'll be talking about next week. We'll be talking about Marooned. And it happens there because they go off and she stays on Red Dwarf, and you've got the autopilots on the Blue Midget and Starbug, but you don't see Holly on there. So it does feel that it's an AI that's being moved around depending on where they want to be.
And that's the thing. At least it's consistent. At least you haven't got 2 Hollys knocking around in the very next episode. So they've obviously thought about it. And honestly, I think the answer, Matt, is plot. Simply put, it wouldn't have suited the two plots that they wanted to tell to have that level of technology. And I also wonder if we're being a little bit 2020. And I also wonder if we're being a little bit 2021 with this, because we have got fantastic tech. But in 1989, would they have had even the kind of inklings of the kind of level of connectivity that we have on all our different devices?
True. Yeah. So but that'd be like if you've got a setup, like for example, I've got like a few Google speakers around the house, whereas a better example would be, okay, I don't use Amazon, but the Alexa. That would be like if you suddenly left the house and then that version of Alexa went with you on the phone. Then if you was living with someone and they tried to go and they went to Alexa, what is so and so, and no one answered because they buggered off with you, buggered off with someone else you live with on their phone.
Well, that's an interesting debate, because you've got you would each have your own individual person, wouldn't you? I mean, I don't know if you've seen the film Her, but that's an operating system, and basically Phoenix falls in love with, and there's a whole aspect of different kinds of things with that, and there's that very issue about that it was his operating system, but then she wants more. So it's kind of like the fact of what is, you can almost get into this debate of what is AI again, because it's like, that was not without spoiling Her. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's an aspect of, is it his? Does he own it? Or is it an actual person? Or an intelligence? And then for Red Dwarf, would that not necessarily mean that Lister would have one? Rimmer would have one. There'll be that aspect of it as well. And would it be a walking, like a walking Rimmer in some ways? Because effectively, that in some ways is what Rimmer is, even though it is originally based on a person.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a deeper sci-fi kind of artificial intelligence thing going on with Red Dwarf, in as much as Holly is very much considered a personality that they talk to as if they are human, in the same way they would talk to Rimmer as if he's human, even though neither of them are. And, neither's the cat, thinking about it.
I'm wondering whether in 2121, in 100 years from now, you're going to get artificial intelligences praising the ingenuity of Red Dwarf for being a show that has more representation of artificial intelligent life forms than human life forms. People look back on dramas. There might be other examples, like for example, Queer as Folk as being the 90s representation of homosexuality on TV. I wonder if people will look back on the Red Dwarf, or artificial intelligence will look back on that and go and think that this will be a good representation of that. Because I just realised there is 3 characters that are technically artificial intelligence and only one human.
So I don't know whether you've rewatched Queer as Folk recently.
I've never watched it, actually.
It has not aged well.
Oh, okay.
The main protagonist, who is portrayed as a very capable and person that you would aspire to be in the gay community, is a rapist.
Okay.
And it's statutory rape. He knowingly has sex with a 15-year-old boy. And it's not great.
Okay, yeah.
The sex scenes, right. So none of the characters, right, let me see how I can answer. The sex scenes aren't anywhere near as raunchy as I remember them being when I was 17 or 18. And the plots, whilst they were deliberately controversial, they are now quite unpleasant. It really does portray almost all of the gay characters as deeply, deeply unpleasant people And the one character that isn't deeply unpleasant is, well, he's a bit of a sap.
Okay. Okay.
It has not aged well, I'm afraid.
Okay.
It was
I've not. Well, I've never watched it. I was trying to think
Russell
of an
Russell T
example.
Davis wrote that, didn't he?
He did.
Is that right? Yeah.
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 I was trying to think of an example to link to the representation of AI, but
But no, I think you have got a genuine point when it comes to how there's a level of acceptance and equality, and I don't even like the word tolerance because it suggests that, you know, tolerating gay people, like there's something to tolerate, you know, but there's a level of non-prejudice amongst all of these characters. They are treating each other as entities rather than I'm this type of entity, you're this type of entity. They're treating each other with respect. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, Rimmer, I don't like you. It's not that I do. I was going to say, it's not that you're a hologram I don't like you. It's because you're a smeghead that I don't like you.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's never prejudiced.
Yeah, and it's the same with Holly, isn't it? It's like, you know, you've got an IQ of 6,000. Really? Yeah, but it's not a thing against the AI. It's more against the person or the thing, and it's classed as banter, isn't it? The way that they play it off. You know, because even in Queeg, you know, you're saying you thought I read my book of encyclopedia from such and such. You know, there's always that frivolity with them all, and it's not. It never feels like it's in. It never feels like it's directed at them with any kind of malice, and I think that's a big point.
Yeah, there's no hate. There's more that they don't like people for their actions and their personality rather than for anything that would be considered a prejudice.
Yeah.
Even though it has looked at, I can't remember what the episode was, but previously Rimmer did touch on the fact that holograms are discriminated against. Like, for example, I think the example he gave was that you haven't got any hologram newsreaders, I think. And so they are aware of prejudice as a thing. It just so happens that none of these characters are. And I think that's great.
Absolutely. So we've done quite well for an episode of with this sci-fi element that we've not really discussed it as such, but I think now's the time. It's always been interesting with Red Dwarf, the way that they blend some sci-fi tropes with the story. I mean, this one's very much a sci-fi story. You know, and they use like real science with it. You know, they talk about the universe expanding and contracting potentially with the theory of the Big Crunch, even though, you know, obviously years down the line, a lot of people believe that it's likely just going to like filter out and just slowly die a very slow and painful death until nothing just exists anymore. But this Big Crunch idea and this universe idea of going backwards through time. There is a lot within this episode that, if you really look into it, that doesn't make sense or doesn't really work. But as a concept and as a comedic concept, I think it does a great job of actually showcasing what kind of humor you can put out there. Now, obviously, one of the first things that they talk about is the you know, in the cafe when they look through the some of the stuff in the newspaper and things. But I don't know about you, but supposedly, Mark, this was there was the scene where before they get to the cafe was filmed in Market Street in Manchester. And,
I did spot that, actually.
And they said that basically that during the filming, because what's really interesting about this concept, I mean, I'm a big concept fan. I love Tenet, I love Inception, all that kind of thing with this, and obviously Tenet is a very, very similar approach, you know, so many years later. But the fact that the very concept is Ed Bye has to work out what he's going to film forwards, what he's going to film backwards, how it's all going to be edited afterwards, because obviously there's a lot of editing to do this, because there will be very different things happening at the same time, scenes that are filmed forwards and scenes that are filmed backwards, just to get the scene working. But then in the middle of Market Street, that you've got someone dressed up like Rimmer and someone dressed up like Crichton walking backwards, and then not one person is even paying any attention to them, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah.
Is that a commentary on Manchester at all? Or?
Manchester's people are the best people. But I feel like when it comes to all of this, the actors, including the extras, all did incredibly well with the kind of big movements to emphasize that it was going backwards. It was really nicely done, I thought, and really thoughtfully done.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, I think was it Rob Grant? I think Rob Grant and was one of them. I think is it Dave Agnew? I can't remember his name now. I think it's Dave Agnew. Was the other? So they're actually using people actually within the show.
No, I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah. So that was really good that they've done.
I think Rob Grant's the guy who's inhaling a cigarette. I think, or exhaling a cigarette, or whatever the opposite of smoking is. Yeah, there's a bit where you see like a guy kind of reverse a cigarette, and I think that's Rob Grant. Yeah.
And what really does date it though is when you get into the cafe and you've got the woman who like sort of pours the ashtray onto the onto the tablecloth and things like that, which was nice to see. But what do you think to the concept, Matt? Was it something that you would levitate towards as a concept within this show? Is it something that you particularly enjoy?
The concept is great, and this is the episode's full of great ways of playing it for hilarity. But the one thing that's always bugged me, and it means that it's never in like my top list of favorite episodes, is that it never fully commits to what it's supposed to be about. So if everything's supposed to be backwards, then everything should be backwards. But the way things and scenes and things are structured, it doesn't make sense, and things happen before they should do. Like for example, like the whole set piece at the very end, is like in completely wrong order, and like quite a few things where, like for example, when they get a lift later on to the pub where Crichton and Rimmer are, it makes no sense that they're asking for a lift and they're given a lift, but it's just driven backwards rather than they actually should have been there at the start and then separated. And the concept's great and it's hilarious, but there's just when you just start thinking about it logically, it just doesn't make sense. And I think once you kind of like break that mold, it's kind of hard to get out of that line of thinking, particularly with this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we've also said whilst doing this podcast is that ignoring continuity errors is okay, but for this, it doesn't make sense. And I'm trying to think back to reading the book backwards, which I know I have read, but for some reason I don't remember it as vividly as I remember Better Than Life, the book that we talked about when we did Better Than Life. But I wonder if the book gets it right, does it better? And I wish I could remember. I don't suppose either of you remember the book.
I've never read any of the books, I think.
I remember, but actually, strange enough, it just reminded me, I mentioned that my family are from Altrincham. I remember reading backwards, actually, in my auntie's house when I was there for a week. Just that's all I did when I went upstairs to bed every night. I used to read that book, but I can't remember too much about it. I think you're right, Mark, that I can imagine reading the book, it would be more structured. Now, supposedly Rob Grant has said that the actual idea for this actually came from a different story. It wasn't anything to do with the Red Dwarf. It was a story that he had about this backward universe, and so it was something that was already in his mind. So I think that in itself is probably to put it onto something as good as, and to be absolutely fair to Red Dwarf, and bear in mind this is 1989 that they're doing this. That yes, we'll pick it apart, where we need to, and I know we don't necessarily do that, and the concept needs to have a little bit of that, but at the time and the technology that they had and the things that they do, I think is a great feat. And I agree. You can look at the bar fight and wonder, well, what started the fight? If you look at the bar fight, the fight begins with Lister being unpunched, but that's right after he right before he chucked the pint glass over the guy, and then you go back in time to when the fight starts, and the fight just stops. And if you were to play that forward, nothing actually starts that fight. It just died. So, you know, and there's like also the scene where you've got the tandem bikes as well. That he wouldn't be nicking that bike off them, and hit the guy and the girl having the picnic wouldn't be getting up saying, why are you taking my bike? So there's a lot of elements like that. But I think that if given the due, I think it's fantastic what they've done. But looking back, and even they themselves would agree that, you know, you look and go, oh, crap, no, I'm not quite sure about that. But going back to that Rob Grant's idea, I think it will be better on the page than it would be in the visual storytelling. I mean, look at Tenet now. I don't know if you've actually seen it, but, you know, I'm going to need to watch it 2 or 3 more times to try and understand it properly. But that is someone who's for years has been honing his trade down there, and he's got a wonderful mind for dealing with this. This is like a 30-minute TV sitcom that's doing it. I think it's incredible for that reason.
I mean, you can make the point that that Red Dwarf is a load of fun, and you cannot just knock points off because of how the kind of plotting and the implementation of the concepts of this episode. But there have been other episodes where the science fiction concepts have been really well done, and again, I think it's more a case of the individual moments of this episode that are really funny and memorable. But in terms of plotting and nailing what the premise is, other episodes have done it better. And I think Backwards kind of loses something because of that. I think other episodes might not have as many moments that are individually funny than perhaps Backwards, but in terms of a plotting thing, as I said earlier, that's one of the reasons it's not as high on my list as other episodes.
I mean, Matt, going to that then. I mean, what do you think over the course of this episode, the first 2 scenes, like we said at the beginning there, were kind of your typical Red Dwarf kind of moments. But during this very thought of the concept and the use of it, I think the bar scene as a fight scene is wonderfully put together. I think it's a great scene, and that's a technical aspect more than anything else. But particular moments for you, Mark, what would you point out in this episode that you believe is memorable, or is the funnier moments that you've really enjoyed within this episode as a whole?
I think that there is a flawed concept, but I'm not sure it matters. And there are some incredibly memorable things, like the cat having a reverse wee and then his face, and stuff like...
I've never thought he'd weed. I thought he was going for number 2.
I thought it was number 2 as well.
Well, I assumed wee because... Mind you, I was going to say it would be particularly unpleasant through that. No, I'd always assumed a wee. But anyway, face is the important part of that. That was what the funny was. And stuff like the Wilma Flintstone gag is an infamous gag from this show that everyone who likes Red Dwarf will remember. And
they used it in the US as well. They remade that scene for the US. That's probably how much they banked on that scene.
Mm-hmm. And I liked the depiction of how dumb British people are abroad when it comes to languages. I thought that was really well done. I thought that was really nice satire. And that's the point, isn't it? It's not supposed to be a slick sci-fi with long ongoing plots that all kind of have these threads and then become this amazing denouement. It's supposed to be lols set in a spaceship.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier about some of the extras or the people around to re-emphasize the fact that it's backwards. I mean, you get that with quite a lot within the episode, don't you? Because obviously you get Lister drinking his pint with Kat, and it's literally like, you know, we're spilling all the way down them, and you know, it's just everything's overemphasized to like sort of renege that point. I mean, one of my particular favourite moments is that, we've mentioned it earlier, the scene where they're getting told off, and just that and my girlfriend actually said to me at the end of that, she went, "Do you really think that you would knock that quietly?" You know, he just goes like that, and it was it. But I do think that that's wonderfully done, because it's like you get this massive rant, and it goes back, and it's just a knock on the door, which is one of my favourite moments of the show. It's so small, it's such a small thing, but it's just wonderfully played.
And there are some really nice gags on this. Absolutely, there are. Matt's fully right when it comes to that it's inconsistent and doesn't actually make any sense if you take a step back and think about it. But I think it's worth it for gags like that.
Oh, definitely. I completely agree on that. I mean, I think my point has been that I think there are premises that have worked a lot better and a lot more consistent. But I think on the flip side, there probably isn't as funny as some of the moments here. Like when it's a barroom tidy, and then suddenly gets
unrumble.
Yeah, because I just figured out what happens to me back, and then I think I can't figure out whether that's actually Craig Charles that goes through or not. Probably isn't, but
it was a pretty good stunt. I'd be surprised if it was Craig Charles. Well, I don't know. Craig Charles maybe when he was younger was maybe a bit more reckless. I don't know.
I can imagine him doing it. I could imagine him doing it. I mean, the other thing as well, I mean, this is just a concept point, is that, you know, it's obviously, it's almost like it's not only a crunch backwards universe, but also a mirror universe, in the fact that, you know, everything's backwards. Nod, for example, you've got the exit signs, you've got the registrations on the van and the taxi as well. So there's a whole like flip side to it as well. You've got milk, for example, which is backwards. So
there's the Nodnall thing, right? My brother and I have always called London Nodnall because of this. My brother lives in bloody Nodnall, and we both, just to each other, not to like random people on the street, we don't want to look like we're not very bright, but we always call it Nodnall. And doing the show has made me realise just how much of the private jokes I have with my brother is basically Red fucking Dwarf.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, other than that, really, unless you've got anything you want to bring up, which I might have missed. I know we've kind of gone over the last segment, because obviously it's a really weird one. You could talk about the minute details and things, but I think sort of with the concept of this, it'd be difficult to do that. Is there anything you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, there's a good question, because there's a very interesting kind of discussion about the nature of life being backwards and the actions that people do, which I thought was quite interesting, actually, where they say there's no death. Like, there's no death. People basically go back in their mums, which is a very weird image when you think about it. But that people kind of gain youth as they go backwards. And like they say that, like, and that Hitler was the guy who liberated France
and bogged off back to Austria.
Yeah. So there's a very, I mean, don't go into that much, but there's an interesting that they mention that, and there's an interesting discussion about what that means. And Lister brings up Sir Francis of Assisi, which is a very kind of weird person to bring up, because I would never have thought that Lister would have known who he is. I mean, to be fair, I had to Google him.
Yeah, but thinking back, they remember Helen Shapiro, but they don't remember William Shakespeare. It's Wilfrid Shakespeare to Rimmer, but he gets Helen Shapiro right. And it all just seems a bit... It is whatever suits for the joke, isn't it? Yeah. And again, does it really matter?
No. I mean, the Santa gag is obviously a brilliant one as well. You know, it's the
Santa gag, great.
But actually, saying that Craig Charles' pronunciation of bastard, it's
bastard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking the Runcorn kind of area of Merseyside, I think, at that point. It seems to have changed a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, you see that, it's whether it's the accent or... But, yeah, I just find that kind of, well, weird. I think, then again, I'm from the Ast pronunciation of a bastard, but...
I say bastard.
No. I say bastard, yeah.
Bastard. I think Game of Thrones is pretty much culturally made sure that everyone pronounces the word bastard properly.
As somebody who's not seen Game of Thrones, I'm one of the none of 50 million that I recently saw. And Matt, I shared this with you recently, where it shows you the TV viewing figures for the past 20 odd years. And Game of Thrones was regularly at 50 million. I'm not one of those 50 million, and that was just in the US as well. That wasn't
50 million is a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that doesn't count the people who watched it on hooky internet sites as well.
Mark, do you have anything else you'd like to bring up?
The only thing that I wanted to point out was it's the first time that we hear the Red Dwarf theme song sung by an actual person. And, we named our podcast after that. I think that's kind of cool.
So before we depart and set our course back to Red Dwarf, Mark, where can people find you online?
I've got 3 other podcasts. First up is Super Tap Film Club, where on a weekly basis I have a look at usually a B movie or a stupid ass action movie with my friends Malachi and Fletch, and we have a jolly good time and a chat about that. You can find that at Tap Club on Twitter. I've also got Right in the Childhood, where me and my mate Fraser take it in turns every fortnight to pick a treasured childhood television show and showcase it to the other one with the hope that it's as good as our memory remembers and it's not shite. That's RITC Pod on Twitter. And finally, I have Life's Milestones, which is a podcast about birth and naming ceremonies, weddings and relationships and funerals and death. That's based on my job as a humanist celebrant at Life's Milestones on Twitter. All of those are available on whatever platform you are currently listening to Shipwrecked and Comatose on.
Excellent stuff. Matt, where can we find Pick a Disc?
You can find listed disc picks on... You can find it on pretty much like the same places that you can find all of Mark's podcasts. To be fair, it's probably the only podcast that he's not on.
I've been on Pick a Disc. I had a dead good choice.
Well, it's the only podcast you don't host, actually, I think of it. From the sounds of it. But basically I interview a guest about an album they picked for whatever reason, and as we are now in 2021, we've now just reached 2 years of age, which is mind blowing. I'm into the 50s in terms of episodes. So if you're not listening to, I've just released a Christmas special, and there's a bunch of little mini episodes where I've talked about my favourite albums of 2020, of last year. Feel free to give them a listen, and if you disagree with me, you probably do anyway. So yeah, give them a listen.
Brilliant. Okay. And if you want to get some ear skip and listen to me, you can listen to me on Make It So, a Star Trek Picard podcast that is hosted by Mark Adams.
What?
Do you not post that? Do you not host that one?
I'd have a go, but I nearly went on the one about Lower Decks because I watched that. I nearly went on that.
Nearly.
My favourite Mark Adams podcast is Serial.
Anyway, so you can find me on Make It So, the Star Trek Picard podcast. Whenever that may be airing, we'll be doing some specials coming up, hopefully going to cover The Dark Veil, which is a Star Trek Picard prequel book. So that's always good to listen to. The X-Cast, the X_cast, which is the X-Files podcast. We're going through season 6 at the moment. And you can also find me on The Time Is Now pod, which is at The Time Is Now pod, which is the Millennium podcast as well. So you can find me on there. and a whole host of other things, which, it's just mental the amount of things that me and Mark are up to at the moment. But thank you very much for joining in and speaking to us again for this week. We'll see you next week for Marooned. But until next time,
Elsewhere on We Made This. The time is now. A Millennium podcast.
But no, I mean, I will say that Rise of the Machines also kind of like argues against
Terminator 2, of course.
Back to where it was.
Like Rise of the Machines, like then goes, maybe they're both right, and shrugs its shoulders. It's like, maybe you can prevent Judgment Day, but only for a little while. And it's like, that's not an argument. Pick a side. Pick a lane. You can either change the past or you can't. None of this wishy-washy. You can change it sometimes, but you can't really change it. So it all balances out. Yeah, no, pick a damn side.
Don't say the C word.
On the back of my right arm, I have a tattoo of Phil Collins. It's the front cover of No Jacket Required.
This was the one that I expected you to pick, I'll be honest with you. Because it is my favourite of your tattoos.
Yeah. I mean, it was a tattoo I got as a joke. A lot of my tattoos that I've got, a lot of everything that I do is because it's a joke or if I think something's funny.
We Buy Records.
Eric Clapton and Van Morrison have released an anti-lockdown song. How do you think about this? Where does this sit on the shitometer?
I think it redefines the shitometer.
Right.
So I think it's raising money for musicians who are affected by the lockdown and the lack of gigs, etc., which is a good thing.
Yep.
But then you see Van Morrison and Eric Clapton, a bad thing. So,
right.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, I love Van Morrison's music. I don't particularly like Eric Clapton's music. I quite like the 60s stuff. But they're a couple of whinging old men, aren't they? Old man babies complaining that they can't go and lick whoever they want.
Ooh.
I know, but that's what they're singing about. I think I haven't checked that. I assume that the lyrics are about.
You can take it as read that I haven't heard it.
It's not likely to have a banging donk on it, is it?
It's unlikely to have a banging donk.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This podcast network, which can be found online at wemadethispod.com or on Twitter at We Made This Pod.